Okay, we'll get started. You guys, thank you so much for joining us on our very first webinar here at Larj Media. I'm Tina Knoll, the founder of Larj Media, and I run the creative side.
And I'm Joelle, and I do pretty much the operations and client management and anything that doesn't have to do with the creative side.
So we'll get started. We're going to run through a slide deck relatively quickly. I have had coffee, so it'll probably go faster than I had planned. And then we will answer all your questions. So we're hoping a lot will be answered with this slide deck, but we will stick around as long as you need to make sure everything is answered.
So what we're going to cover, pretty soup to nuts, is from the top, just how we think about podcasting just as an organization and how we've come to understand it within the industry. We'll get really into what is a branded podcast specifically, the power of a podcast for your brand, and all the various advantages that come with, saddling a brand and a podcast together. We'll get into audience demographics, who's listening, kind of what the market's looking like now, and then measuring success, ROI. That's a big hot topic. In an ever-changing landscape. And then we'll talk a little bit more just about like how it actually gets done, what are some kind of frameworks around cost, and then we'll just open it up to questions.
So again, we're a woman-owned agency. I founded it. Joelle came aboard 5 years ago. A lot of you know this, but some of you may not. I have a background in journalism. I was at CBS News in New York, Cairo Radio here in Seattle. So I have a long radio and audio storytelling background. And Joelle came from Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in the tech world and also in marketing agencies and in startups. And so I understand a combination of scale and also client services and how to sort of structure a services organization. And so it really made a perfect match.
Yep. So we have grown now. We have a studio, recording studio here in Fremont in Seattle, and producers and editors all over the country. So here's how we think about podcasts at Larj Media. It's important to kind of lay this groundwork so that you really understand where we're coming from when we think about podcasts and how we make things. I say this a gazillion times in all of our presentations, and it's all over our website, that the importance of understanding the intimate and conversational nature of this podcast environment, because it creates that really sticky brand engagement, and listeners really build a relationship with the podcast they're listening to, the story that's being told to them, the host that's talking to them in their ears.
And we know this. There's a really interesting study that came out of Berkeley where, if you're familiar with the Moth Radio Hour podcast, they used that particular podcast and they put people in an MRI to watch their mind, how their brain lights up in various ways.
And the Moth is really just one person behind a microphone telling a real life story. So it's a really personal and intimate experience for the listener.
And what they found was instead of just lighting up the language part of the brain, the brain really lit up everywhere. Is if this was an experience this person was having for themselves. It's such a because it's in your ear and there isn't any kind of ambient interruption. Your theater of the mind takes over, and becomes such an immersive experience that you remember it. It becomes really deeply embedded in memory, and then also you become pretty fluent in the language that you're talking. You've heard that story and you can retell it with pretty accurate details because it's so immersive and such a personal experience that you have. So
in the study, they talk about like a dog. Like if the story is a dog, the part of your brain that associates dog lights up because you will begin to make personal associations with that thing. And if you're a podcast listener, and I imagine most of you are, you probably make up who somebody looks like. Like I've never seen Terry Gross, but I have a picture of her in my mind, which is also really interesting. All to say that intimacy level is really important to always keep in mind as you're creating podcasts, as you're listening, and for really what it means for brand awareness, brand affinity.
Because it becomes such a personal experience for them. So the other element of podcasting, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, is that you are out doing something that takes really little cognitive load, like walking the dog, driving or doing some chores. And so while you're physically doing these things, you're having this physical experience. This is why it increases memory and it builds on your habit. So you're walking the dog and you'll go back and listen to the same podcast. You build this behavior into your daily life. And so we find that people who are listening to podcasts are listening to up to 7 in a week. They're sticking with it. It lasts for as long as it takes to do a certain task or activity. And so it is very habit forming. And with a brand, if you can imagine what it's like to spend 30 or 45 minutes with your customer or your client or your followers for 30 minutes every other week or every week, that's a pretty powerful relationship that you build.
So who are these people? They podcast listeners, and you are all likely among them. They are smart, they're affluent, they're relatively young. And so just knowing, especially as we're talking more about brands, knowing who these people are is really important. Now, your specific audience will probably fit somewhere around here, but this is the average podcast listener. So what's this mean for brands? We want to ground this in what a branded podcast is in the first place. I think a lot of people can be very confused about that sound because it can kind of be a turnoff. So the idea here, and as we think about creating podcasts for brands, we really want to think about it's like a gift to their audience. It's not an infomercial. It's not a hard sell. It's a story.
It's a great way to help a brand identify and sort of reveal who they are and what they're about, and also to establish a space inside the market to say, we are in this market, we own this market space, or, to really create a affinity in with your customer around in your brand space. Okay. One quick thing, just going back on that branded podcast concept, is for a person who's listening to the podcast, it doesn't matter that it's a branded podcast. It essentially just means it's funded by a brand, but that's mostly not necessarily important to anybody who's listening.
Lately we've been talking about a lot about the Barbie movie, and the Barbie movie is essentially a branded movie for Mattel, but it was incredibly well made, a beautiful piece of artwork, a wonderful show, a wonderful movie, right? And you're not going there like feeling like you're going to be sold Mattel, but you might leave there wanting a Barbie. So that whole experience, you can just translate that into ears in terms of how branded podcasts might work. And what's really exciting about making a podcast for a brand or for anything really is that it's not just a podcast. It can be the pillar of your entire marketing ecosystem. So when we're creating a podcast, we're creating additional assets across your channels. Things like short videos for Reels on Instagram, audiograms, maybe 1 minute of the show that showcases part of it to bring people in, but even more content from an episode. You can create an entire LinkedIn article, a blog post, again, video for TikTok and Instagram. So there's this really wonderful thing that can happen as you're creating your podcast. You can use it as kind of the fertile ground for your entire marketing ecosystem. And I find that to be something that can be missed when people think about investing in a podcast or the ROI on a podcast and stuff like that. Great. Danielle, I see your note. Okay. So what are the advantages of a branded podcast?
Well,
do you want to do this one?
I will jump right in.
Okay.
One of the great things is that you're going to reach your audience where they previously could not be reached. So it's in their me time, in their private space. And that makes it additive to your marketing mix. It's not something you're going to say the same thing in a video or they're going to see the same thing on Instagram. It's going to be something that's exclusively in their ears, and it's a personal, thing that you're reaching. We find that the listen through rate is really successful on podcasts. So with video, the drop off is somewhere around, often 50% or less. With podcasts, people listen to 80% or more. And so that constant engagement I mentioned earlier on a regular basis is really, really creates a deep relationship in a way that most of the other channels don't offer. You'll build affinity, favorability. People love to share what they hear, and so they're going to get into your ecosystem. They're going to want to comment. They're going to ask questions. They're going to be curious about the story. They're going to want to see pictures. And so it really, you're driving people into your whole ecosystem. You will own and drive the conversation in your market space. So as the podcast gets out, you're able to comment about your competitors. You can have opinions about things inside your conversation because you own it, and your audience is dedicated to coming back and listening to hear what you have to say about whatever that is. You'll build and strengthen your workforce. A lot of people are kind of surprised to find that everybody in the company listens to the podcast, and that gives them insight into maybe leadership voices. There's a lot of market space for internal podcast companies doing podcasts for their employees, but it becomes a symbol or a representation of your company out into the world, and people who are thinking about whether or not they want to come work for that company are going to be listening to that podcast and starting to understand a little bit more about what kind of company they want to be working with. Just developing talent, it's a really powerful channel for just that. And then, of course, creating a channel to gather customer data and insight. We're learning a lot about user behavior and how customers are feeling about your products, because you're getting insight. You learn about where they're coming from. You learn about who they are through a lot of the data that we're getting off of our platforms, but then also being able to guide business decisions. You'll get feedback and be able to engage really deeply with customers. So there's a ton of opportunity in this space if you're looking for it.
Driving results. So how do we measure success of a podcast? There are lots of different ways. And I think the first thing that people think about is number of people listening. And we get that a lot with branded clients. We just had it recently with a new client, really concerned about the number of people listening. The unique thing about podcasting is there's such a bigger, broader story to tell besides just that number. Because when you think about even 100 people engaged with your messaging or your story for a half hour or longer every week after week, and coming back for more, that's very powerful. So it's not just about the volume. There's so many other things that we can tell about your listener and how successful your show is. So the podcast consumption rate, for instance, that's how long people are staying with your podcast. So if you have a 45-minute podcast, our metric systems can show you when people drop off. Are they dropping off halfway through, or are they listening all the way through? If they're listening all the way through, and most of the time they do, if your podcast is good and it's hitting the target, they're going to listen all the way through. If they're not, you got to ask yourself some questions.
Let's click to the next one. I think we have a little bit about size of audience, and there's a lot to be said about this. People think, if you're not Dax Shepard, or you're not getting millions of downloads, your podcast's not successful, and that's just absolutely not true. Depending on your actual audience size and the size of your brand, that should be a reflection of, you will get a percentage of that audience size. And having, like Tina mentioned earlier, just having people return week after week, even if that's only a couple of hundred people coming back to your brand for 30 minutes or more a week or every other week, that's a really significant level of, relationship that you're building. And so downloads is not something we ignore at all, but it is a slice of a much bigger pie, and there's a lot more color that goes with podcast metrics and success metrics than just downloads.
And I think it can't be understated that the beauty of the podcast medium too is that someone is intentionally choosing your podcast over the many podcasts that are out there. And so that discovery is, so you're really hitting your exact target. Like if I'm interested in fishing, there's a sea of fishing shows. I'm fishing for fishing. Okay. No, so you know what I mean.
Okay, let's just.
So how and how much? All right. So we're going to go into exactly how we work, but and generally how to put a podcast together, how long it takes, and how much it costs, which is kind of the burning question I think most people have.
Yeah.
But the way that we work is we start every client off with what we call our Jumpstart program. This is the part where, and any company that you work with, or if you're doing your own podcast, you must do this in order to get it right. And this is spending all that time up front to really get to know who you want to talk to, what you want to say to them, and what you want them to do when they're done listening to your podcast.
This is also the time that you want to establish what your success metrics really are going to be. How are you going to know that you're doing this right and well? And it really roots in the purpose of the podcast. That is a North Star that gets built at this phase, and it lasts throughout the production, season after season. You still come back to this space and say, like, is this still lining up? Is this show still lining up with its original intention? So really important.
The full framework for your show. So that's Jumpstart. After that, we head into production. This is the time that we're capturing audio. We are refining. We're doing our story development. Head into post-production. That's the editing time. At this point, we're also beginning to create the infrastructure for your show, putting it on the platforms, creating marketing assets, all that additional material that I talked about before that you can repurpose through all your social channels and your marketing strategy. So that's all being collected during production and then refined during the post-production period. And then we head into publishing and promotion. And we sometimes, I think the old school thinking of podcasts was you had to like make an episode and release it, release it. That is just a recipe for disaster unless you're really needing to respond to news or, trends or something like that. So producing a bunch of episodes up front gives you that an opportunity to create that strategy, marketing plan, and affords time for refining the show as you're going.
Yeah.
So their team involved. These can sometimes be one person. These sometimes can be combined roles, but we always have creative approvers. People on the team, maybe your client that will approve an episode of the content. Your producer manages the overall production. They have their arms around every aspect of the show. Your editor obviously is they work tightly with the producer. They're handling, rounds of revisions. They're editing the material. Your editor may even have a lot of creative input in terms of how the soundscape's going to be. Writer, researchers, sound engineers, and, obviously your equipment in your studio. Want to talk about timeline?
Standard timeline. I mean, a lot of things come into play depending on the scope of the content. But in a general sense, it's much harder to do the first 4 to 6 episodes. You kind of want to allow time to build that workflow and that production process, but it gets really quick and efficient once you get going. So I would say you really want to allow somewhere between 6 to 8 months to get a full 10 episode series completely developed. You can start publishing after about 4 are finished and in the can. So it doesn't mean that you have to wait till they're all finished, but it is important to allow the learning and the sort of the ramp up phase in the very beginning. But we have clients now that are, cooking along, and we can get as many as, 4 episodes a month complete. And that allows for, we, bake them all up. And then there's like some nice downtime, a hiatus for the production team to be able to kind of, sit and regroup before starting another round.
I will say the interesting thing about the production timelines and workflows is because this is a unique medium and it's often a lot of people's first time into a foray into a production. It starts out, there's a lot of time up front. That time up front saves you time in the end. And then things tend to run very kind of quicker and smoother toward after you're into it for maybe 4 or 6 episodes. So here's pricing in a range.
Yeah, I mean, again, content is a big driver for the range, but we want to be as transparent as possible and really give you a good idea of how this really works. With Jumpstart,
can I jump into just about format real quick? Do you think it's time to do that? Okay. So the things that can affect cost and time are really the story you're going to tell. So if it's your CEO behind a microphone week after week,
which we don't recommend.
We don't really, but let's just say you want to do that. And they give 5 inspiring tips, every episode or something like that. That's one level of lift. But something like a story, like what we did with Inspired Design, is we're collecting sound in the field. We're telling us like a mini documentary every episode. There's just a lot more at play with a production that's a little bit bigger than that. So, so as you think about format or the story that you're going to tell, there's a lot of thought that goes into how you're going to really tell that story. And again, all depending upon who you want to hear it.
Right. So the Jumpstart phase, at least for us, is, ranges between 15 and about 22K, somewhere around there. That is a thing where you can decide you're going to bring the show in-house from that phase, and we will help, or whoever you're working with in that planning phase should help you to create a workflow and a sustainable process within your house. So if that means setting up a studio, putting some roles together, helping people understand what their job is as part of the production team, getting that, up and running, then, you take some internal costs, obviously, on your own. And, you're not paying an agency for production, or maybe you're paying an agency for part of production. But what you're looking at on this slide is mostly the assumption that you would be working with a production shop. And our rates are fairly in line with this. This is not unusual, not something you would just find with us. You'll find it pretty much everywhere. And so somewhere between 15 or 45K is probably the least expensive, which is, if you're doing the math on a per episode number, that's probably pretty standard, around 4,500 per episode. We don't price per episode. Not too many shops do, because the size of an episode, it's so rangy. You can have a 15, 20-minute episode. You can have an hour-long episode. You can have a
bonus episode that's
break it into 2, so you have a 2-parter. There's so much variability there that we just
time box it instead of putting it, instead of charge by.
And then there's the option, you may work with a third-party agency or brand agency that would create a lot of the assets that come off of the podcast to support it. So, obviously we do that. We work with agencies to do it. That's generally a per episode price, because you're deciding with each episode what assets you're going to use for create out of it. And then we really recommend to get that audience, you're going to want to do a little bit of a paid campaign. And the best practice is to advertise within another podcast or on podcast platforms. You want to catch people where they are thinking about podcasting, and if they're out looking for a podcast, then they're in a place where they want 30 minutes of something to do that's not going to require their hands or their eyes. And so they're going to hear about your podcast in a podcast.
And, during that discovery phase, we do some thinking around, like, what's your audience already consuming? Like, what are they into? And that serves that time really serves to then, when your paid campaign comes along, you get them where they are.
Right.
And thank you. So we have a list of resources too we'll make available, but let's go ahead and open it up to questions. And I think it's just a matter of typing them into the chat thing. Carmen, you want us to talk a little bit about Inspired Design? That is a project we did with the Seattle Design Center, and there's a little bit of delay.
There's time. I see. Yeah.
So we did a project with the Seattle Design Center called Inspired Design. And what they originally came to do is they wanted to just interview designers about design. And so we looked at this as a real opportunity for a branded podcast to really reach people. Their audience was really young folks, maybe building a new home or designing their kitchen. They're affluent, they have enough money to kind of be thinking really intentionally about design. And they wanted to make the Seattle Design Center more accessible, to have people understand, like, this is a place you can come to get inspiration and ideas. And so what we did is we decided to make the podcast about creative spaces all over Seattle. So we've identified artists, makers, chefs, creative folks, and we asked them if we could go into their place, into their creative space, and they could share with us what inspires them. So we recorded it all in the field, and each episode was a different location and a different maker that was inspired by that location. So I think our first episode, for instance, was Chef Tom Douglas in his home kitchen that he designed himself. And he just talked about, he kind of gave us a tour around his kitchen, which was very eclectic and cool. And the idea there was that, if you're interested in creativity and design, that you're going to come back week after week and you're wondering, oh, what's Louis Gong? What's his inspired place? What inspires him as an artist, as a creator? And we ended up, didn't we win an award for that one?
Yeah, Marcom Award.
Oh, and we won an award for that one too. Anyway, it's a good show. And there's a case study on our...
Tanya asked, how often do you actually talk about the brand in a branded podcast?
Great question.
I'll let you answer. I have thoughts, but
Well, I think there's two ways to handle that. With Inspired Design, what we did is we actually put a commercial, like a 30-second commercial, in the middle of the show for the Seattle Design Center. So we kind of didn't have to really do a lot of talking about the brand in there with that commercial in there. It's also clearly brought to you by the Seattle Design Center. So the vision there is that, people kind of get it. But I think
people don't want to hear, if you're listening to a podcast, you're not there to hear somebody tell you about their brand. You're there because, Patagonia, you like outdoors and gear and stuff. And so you're not listening for Patagonia to tell you all about their, ripstop nylon. You're here to learn.
Hear about hiking stories, because you're a hiker and you're into that stuff. Yeah.
Harrowing stories of mountaineering. Those are the things that you have in common with your customer. Your brand shares common likes and common interests. That's why your customers are listening. So talk about the things that you have in common with your listeners and your customers. That's what builds the coming back in the relationship, not so much information about why the brand is as great as it is. Hope that answers that question.
Oh, I'd love an example of B2B subject.
Business to business. That's a good one. Let's see. We are doing
Pivotal?
I think that's a pretty good one, where a brand is sort of reflecting into another, their customer base is other brands.
We have a show called Pivotal with Hayete Gallot. It's Microsoft is the client. So it's considered a branded podcast for that reason. And she's telling pivotal stories about when people from the front line all the way to the C-suite have discovered a problem in their workspace and solved it themselves. Like, they were empowered to solve the problem. And so we looked at a bunch of case studies at Microsoft with their customers, and we found people inside these case studies that had these experiences. For instance, one of the episodes was about the Jane Goodall Institute, and this researcher who discovered that they could use AI and some Microsoft products to better refine the way that they research chimpanzees. So the story was really about him and his life and why he became a researcher, and then the problem that he discovered, and then how he solved it. So that was a solid kind of, I think, B2B approach.
That whole podcast is B2B, really, because it is demonstrating how other businesses are leveraging Microsoft technologies to solve real life problems. And this new season we're working on is really AI focused, of course. And it's very much businesses talking to other businesses.
Pepper, this is a great question. Do you approach the brand with the story you want to tell, or wait for the brand to come to you, or no way to get to where you're going. Do you mean, I think that I believe that this is what you're saying, that when a brand comes to you, do we get them to kind of tell us the story that they want to tell? Is that what she's asking?
I think so, yeah.
So
we don't pitch. We don't go to them with what we think they ought to be doing. Yeah, they come to us.
Not yet. I mean,
we're not above it.
Yeah, we're not above it. But yeah, I think that like pivotal, like when Microsoft came to us, they wanted to do, this is a good example, I think maybe of what you're kind of talking about, and kind of what Seattle Design Center did too. They often will come to us with an idea, like this is the story we want to tell, or this is a customer that we want to talk to. But there is still a gap between people's understanding of a chat show and what's possible in the podcast space. So people kind of think of podcasts as just like a person behind a microphone talking to another person or doing an interview. And we are really, in the business of expanding that creative brain to help clients understand that you can really get some rich, beautiful storytelling inside the branded podcast space. For instance, Gimlet did a great show with Ford. Ford was the brand, and they told the story of the history of the Ford Bronco. And it's really good. And it's rich with story, and it's documentary style. It's got all these cool things. So
what we do when a brand comes to us, when someone wants to make a podcast we distill, like, what do they want to say? Who are they trying to reach? And then we turn around and give them concepts back that fit within their goals. So we think about, we're going to make a show that's going to reach that audience and achieve the kind of things that they need to achieve with their podcast. And we give them at least three concepts, that range in sort of the price space that they're trying to aim for. So we work really very collaboratively, but we almost never make the podcast that they thought they were going to make when they came to us.
All right. Thanks you guys so much for joining us. Again, please link in with us, holler with any other questions, and enjoy your day. Okay. Bye, guys. Thanks so much.